Welcome everyone to the conversation around licensing. It's difficult to near impossible to talk about OER and open in general without talking about licensing, because intrinsically the concept of open originates from the ability in order to share. Sometimes I refer to it within the context of sharing as caring model. And more specifically, when an intellectual property owner, an author, for example, of a content creates something, they will share it if they want it to be open, and the complexities, both legal and otherwise, involved in being able to ensure that that's done successfully can be very difficult in order to navigate within the OER landscape. And I wanted to be able to talk about this a bit. And I also want to be able to talk about how LibreText is designed in order to address that, because we have a fairly complicated infrastructure in place in order to be able to do that. And I use the term complicated by saying that things on the back end are actually complicated. They're meant in order to make things easier for people on the front end like you in order to be able to do that stuff. So let's get this thing going. This general outline is going to involve a little bit of work on your side. So I'm going to put kind of homework that's not really homework for you guys to do when we discuss this stuff. And then, but before we get into that, I'll be talking about the philosophy of OER in general and the legalities and the ethics associated with OER. And this is a topic that can easily spend multiple full-time days in order to be able to address. In fact, the Creative Commons Foundation has a certificate that I believe is a 12-day or 12 half-day process in order to be able to master much of the material that actually all the material I'm talking about today. So let's go back into defining what OER is. And even this by itself can be a contentious topic in the community. I'm going to put out two definitions of OER. One is the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation definition. That foundation was particularly critical in the early days of OER, and still is now, in terms of promoting OER and advocate for OER. So the definition is somewhat the de facto definition in the United States. And then the UNESCO definition that came around a few years ago, which obviously has an intended audience that's more global than just the US. And they have very similar to near identical with a few key aspects that distinguishes the two. So the Hewlett Foundation definition is arguing that OER are free and openly licensed educational materials that can be used for teaching, learning, research, and other purposes. So the idea is that the O is open, so you freely distributed. E is for the educational component associated with that, and then it's a resource for people to tap into. The key point off of here is the openly licensed aspect, which means that you have to involve law. It's a legal application in terms of defining what exactly an open license is, and then how you can actually use that open license there. The term free, in this case here, doesn't necessarily mean that it is freely available without costs. It means it has the ability in order to be freely available or freely accessible. And it sounds kind of odd the way I described it like that, but it's possible to have OER behind a barrier, a paywall, for example, within this definition. So there's a lot of OER out there that is openly licensed, but not easily accessible. And you could argue that goes against the philosophy of OER, and it does. But nonetheless, that's one mechanism that people can monetize OER. And there are a lot of individuals and organizations that have a great interest in order to monetize OER, including even big publishing houses, as they start to see that OER infrastructure is growing and cutting into their market. So the UNESCO definition, again, is very similar. OER are teaching, learning, and research materials that are in the public domain or released with intellectual property licenses that facilitate the free use, adaptation, and distribution of resources. So again, this intellectual property licenses that facilitate free use, that's basically open license argument here. Public domain, if you're unfamiliar with it, it basically means that there is no license associated with it. It's freely available for anybody to do anything they want with it without any limitations off there. So you can think of it as the most open of open licenses, but it's not really technically a license. And again, the argument here is for free use use, adaptation, and distribution of resources. The UNESCO definition generally is used in order to argue that the content needs to be free for people to access that. So it has a slightly different financial aspect than the Hewlett Foundation offer there. But the key point here, again, is that OER involves law. And that's a fundamental argument that we want to do. So in order to discuss that, we need to talk about what openly licensed or open licenses are. And this has been a movement for multiple years in the ed tech community. And this has been spearheaded by software, largely individuals that are creating software and wanted to be able to distribute that software freely to other people in order to build upon. So what's referred to as open source software. OER is a branch off of that, one can argue, that used to rely on the same licensing as the software infrastructure. But then in the last several decades has expanded into its own set of licensing, and by far 95 to 98% of OER out there is licensed under a Creative Commons license, which is a different license than what's used in the open source, which can range from things like GNU or MIT or BSD or other infrastructure out there. And I don't have the time nor even the desire to go into open source licensing because it has its own bit of complexities that I'm not a master of. But again, we're focusing on OER here. So the idea behind here is to distinguish something that is sometimes an issue in the English language. So in the English language, we use the term free for describing two concepts that many other languages separate into two different words. So we use free to mean free from cost, or we use free as in free from external limitations. So in the Latin languages, the Romance languages, that would be referred to as gratis or liberté, or Libra, hence the origin of Libra and Libra text. So the argument behind here is that there's a distinction between the two, and that's actually part of the issues associated with the definitions between the Hewlett Foundation and the UNESCO definition out there. So the argument is essentially open licenses allow content to be free of liberty from restrictions, not necessarily from costs. And that's, again, folded into a variety of different infrastructures from Creative Commons, GNU. Public domain is not technically a license, but available. Sometimes we'll collectively refer to them as copyleft. But because there's a range of different licenses and different licenses have different components, the responsibilities of them, sometimes you'll get communities or people in communities that will be very aggressive about one license being better than another license. And I encourage you, if you ever get in that sort of conversation, to just turn around and leave that discussion, because it's an exercise in extreme futility in order to be able to debate about which license is better than another license, although they certainly do have different applicabilities, which is important in order to discuss, and that's what we're doing right here. So the upshot, again, with this thing, as I mentioned before, the sharing is caring model is that someone creates content, owns the content, is the intellectual property owner of that content, and shares it for other people to use. And that's the open aspect. When someone does that, they do not relinquish the ownership of that content. They still own it, and they own it in perpetuity. What they are doing is they're saying they own it, they'll let other people use it, but they have to use it in a certain way. And if they don't use it in a certain way, some of the licenses allows you to revoke it. Some of the licenses will have certain periods of time in which you can get in compliance with the license. But the key point is that you're never an owner of the content that you're doing. So the vast majority of the content on the LibreText is not owned by LibreText Inc. Or any of the individuals that are spoken today. Well, actually, several people spoke today, technically. So the success stories, they own the content that's out there, but we obviously have access to it. That's all perfectly fine as long as we fit within the boundaries of this license. But it's a key point in order to emphasize that you can only use this stuff because of the open license behind it. And if something doesn't have a clear open license on it, you don't have the clear rights in order to be able to use it. And that applies everywhere, and certainly on the internet. So if you find something that you like on the internet, it's pretty, it looks cool, we routinely, as instructors, will grab it and paste it into our PowerPoint file. Now that's protected by what's called fair use in order to be able to follow through with that. And fair use is a different ball game that requires lots of other conversations behind it. It's not protected by the legality of the license off here, but you can't do that in your textbooks that you're distributing that could potentially infringe upon the financial aspects of the intellectual property owner. So in other words, only use content that you know you're allowed to use. Now that means everything on the LibreText. So that's just a broad infrastructure that we've established. It means everything on Wikipedia, for example. But when you go to other places, you need to be very careful to pay attention to the laws behind it. And we're going to go through some exercises in order to have you identify this in a handful of different sources that's out there. But it's, again, important that just because you bring it in does not mean you own it. Okay, so like I mentioned before, English has this designation of differences between liberty and cost. Open is the opposite of closed, which means the opposite of all rights reserved, which means no rights given. Open is different from liberty. Open as liberty is different, but then the question is how free or how open is it? The same thing also associates with costs. Now, at this point, I do want to mention here that and this sounds kind of weird. Some people view this in slightly different way, but it's important for many of us to recognize that everything costs something. OER costs something. The issue, and all OER costs something. The issue is who pays and how much. So when you have Frank, for example, building the finance book that's off of here, he paid with his time. And he put it out there, and then we got to benefit from that. The commercial publishers, they pay with their time and money, and it's not freely available or freely accessible. Every single infrastructure has to, in order to distribute it, has to pay in order to be able to maintain it, including LibreText. Our servers, our technical staff, our support, those are all need to be paid by someone. Now, we're fortunate that we got grants, both from the U.S. Department of Education, from the state of California, in order to be able to maintain it. But when people argue things are free, in reality, they're never 100% free. Someone pays something somewhere. And the question then becomes who pays for it and how much. So get off that soapbox and get into the discussion of back to what OER constitutes. So I mentioned before that OER can be defined in a variety of different ways, practically. So the definitions I gave before involved open licenses on it, but there are different sets of open licenses that have different permissions. So while people may argue OER's definitions in different ways, from a practical perspective, there is a constitution that's generally agreed upon about what OER means, which gives you what are the limits of openness that you're allowed to have in order to say something as OER. Now again, this is not codified by anybody. It's just how the community addresses, and that's called the 5 R's. The 5 R's were constructed or postulated about 20 years ago by David Wiley in terms of providing you with the where are we here? Providing you, okay, here we go, with certain rights. So these are the 5 rights that you must have access to be OER. One is the right to retain, which means that you can hold on to it so it doesn't disappear. So for those of you that are familiar with the commercial publishers, that will give you the access to a textbook, and then after a certain period of time, you lose access to the textbook, a digital version, that is. So you don't have the rights to retain off of that. There's no one would call that OER for a variety of other reasons. So the ability in order to hold on to content is one of the key critical components of OER. One is the ability to reuse that content. So you then have the ability to take it and recreate adaptations, edit it, hold on to it, generate a new product off of that. The other one is, again, part of the reuse, which is the revision in order to be able to adapt, modify, and alter its content off of there, not just being able to have copies of that you're able to distribute. Remixing is the ability to basically what you learned 2 days ago, to be able to take and slice and dice content to create something new. So not just an adaptation, you can create a new infrastructure that contains of multiple components that are added into it. And lastly, the rights of redistribution. So the ability in order to say, I've created it and now I can distribute it. And if you have all 5 of those things, most people in the community would call it OER. That's out there. So there's OER and then there's OER. So the idea behind OER with the big O is that it is a very different paradigm for the way we view ownership and the way that we address academia than how we've been trained in the past, which has been very much taking ownership of things and being able to sell them in a variety of ways. So from an academic perspective, we're used to the concept of creating something and getting credit for it, which is great, and then being able to have control over who gets access or who gets to use your resources, just like personal resources, right? You don't give everybody in this room the ability to go into your house and take anything they want. So you have some limitations. They view that as a private thing. Publishing operates in a similar way traditionally. Publishing houses generate products and they sell the products. And you have the rights to some of the things in the OER, keeping it, maintaining it, but you can't distribute it in various ways. You can't do lots of aspects associated with it. And most business models conflict with openness. The reason for that is most business models rely on selling a product. And OER itself, within the licenses that we talked about, makes it difficult in order to be able to use that as a business model. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't make money off of OER. I already mentioned that there are other people who do that, but they have to provide other value-added components in order to supplement what the core OER infrastructure is out there. And more companies are starting to recognize ways in order to go about doing that in the past. Lumen Learning, for example, is one of the bigger commercial enterprises around OER, who was co-founded by David Wiley, the originator of the 5 Rs that I mentioned before. This is somewhat of a paradigm shift between the way that we think and the way, and many people in the community, academic or otherwise, don't fully understand what OER implements. And it also, many people who are in the OER community don't fully understand what OER implements. And the principal example of that is that when you generate something and you make it OER, you are basically saying that you release the rights to control who has access to it and how people use that access. And that's the key point. And many of us in academia, we want to be able to say, we create OER and we host it on this one platform and we don't want any other platforms to have it. That is not open. That is a conflict between the very basic essence associated with openness. This is one of the reasons why I like to argue that the LibreText is meant in order to take the 5 Rs and institutionalize it and scale it up to the fullest potential, in that we grab everything that we can and we bring it into our central repository via the harvesting efforts. And there are people who have concerns about that, saying, well, I created it over here. I don't want you to use it over there. That's not open. And even the licenses don't provide you the ability in order to control those sort of things. So I'm bouncing around a little bit in order to talk about what you can and can't do with licensing, and I'm making things a little bit muddled down. I'm going to start to decompose that into specific protections under the Creative Commons licensing off of here. So whenever you have a resource that is meant to be openly licensed, you can view the open license tag, the designation that that resource is an open license, as a sign, a pre-permission for you to use it subject to the limitations associated with that license. I could think of this as a free stuff sign when you put something out on your front porch after you move. If you haven't done that, you probably have seen that sometime or another, especially when students are coming and going from your town. And it basically means that you don't have to consult with the author in terms of being able to use it productively for your own needs. They've given you pre-permission in order to be able to do it. So feel free to use that as freely as you want to, but you need to be able to pay attention to what exactly the permissions are that the licenses that provides. So now everything we'll be talking about is going to be Creative Commons licensing. If you want to discuss any of the other more boutique licenses out there, we can do so if we have some available time, and how they interact with the other licenses and other aspects connected to it. Again, this starts getting into a lot more complexity behind it. This is all based on law. If you're unfamiliar with law or the finer details of law, these things are only codified by legal precedent. So in other words, you have to have a lawsuit in order to be able to justify these sort of things. And there have been at least one, and I think maybe two legal precedents is established on Creative Commons, and I can talk about at least one in a moment here. So let's talk about licensing or open licensing. So I already mentioned public domain before. Public domain is not an open license. It is actually the lack of a license, open or otherwise. So if anything is in the public domain, you can do what you want with that. Public domain, another way in order to view that, is saying that it's owned by everyone in the community. And public domain is not a global infrastructure. Every country has their own implications on what's in the public domain and what's not in the public domain. So it can get complicated when you actually move content from one domain for another domain. Again, that's a topic that we can discuss if you guys have an interest in that at a later time. But I want to mention one of the more beautiful things that have been implemented within the Constitution. I believe is the Constitution, certainly within the founding years of our country, is that we believe that after a certain period of time, that anything that's been created that is open or closed, licensed, after a certain period of time goes automatically into the public domain. And this is really beautiful. So it's basically saying that when you created something, it then becomes publicly owned and everyone can benefit from it at one point or another. And I'm not sure if this date is correct or maybe the subsequent date off of here. So basically things that have been released or published before 80 years ago. Is that right? That's actually 100 years. I'm off on this date here, so please don't quote that date. I need to take a look at the current version of that. Is in the public domain. So many of you may have heard that the original Mickey Mouse for Disney is now in the public domain, or will be in the public domain at the end of this year. That was the situation several decades ago. Disney did not want it to go into the public domain because they still made a lot of money off of that. They wanted to hold on to their intellectual property rights, and they passed a law. Let me rephrase that. They lobbied to have it passed a law in order to extend that period of time, sometimes referred to as the Mickey Mouse Act, which, as far as I'm concerned, was a really bad thing for the overall community. But this is really great. So if you have old content, it's all public domain, and you're able to tap into it and use it for your own purposes. However, it's also understandable that much of that old content may not be overly applicable for your own purposes. Now, one of the nice things about that is that means that if everything from Victorian age literature to Civil War maps are all available, as long as you could find it in order to be able to be used off there. I mentioned the GNU public licenses. This is probably the second most popular licensing in OER. Wikipedia used to use this up until, I think, 2010. It might be 2009 as their infrastructure before they adopted Creative Commons licensing. It is more applicable, or more useful at least, for discussing of open source software, but it has its own range of technologies out there. And lastly, Creative Commons licensing, which is the topic of our aspect here. And Creative Commons licensing it has a range of responsibilities and permissions that are dictated by the nature of the license. So it has 9 different licenses, and each license has 4 different options that are used in different mixtures in order to be able to do. And that's what we're going to be discussing here. So the 4 things that I want to discuss is attribution, share alike, non-commercial, and no derivatives. So when someone adds a Creative Commons license to a resource that they're sharing with the community, they have to dictate one or multiple requirements that they want other people to use that license. to ensure compliance in order to use that license, and then obviously the content behind that license. So this is important not just for the author that is creating it, it's important for individuals that are trying to capitalize on it and use it productively. And that's both within the Liber verse and the LibreText specifically, and within the greater OER landscape that's out there. So the first one is attribution. It's essentially arguing that if something has the by attribution, which is every license, with the exception of the public domain version that's in the Creative Commons landscape, it means that you are allowed to use it, but you need to provide attribution. That's it. So people only want credit for what they want to do, and you can use it in any way that you want as long as you handle that attribution. That's the sole requirement that they have put onto the case here. Now, the attribution requires has a little bit of flexibility behind it. Unless they've explicitly argued that you need to attribute it in a certain way, you have the ability in order to have a few different things addressed in the attribution, and then it's out there, including the author, including in the attribution, you need to put the license, and you need to put a link or a source to where that content came from. And that's anywhere and everywhere that you use that resource. Let me skip share alike. I want to get to that in a moment. I want to go into something a little bit easier to comprehend, which is non-commercial. So if someone slaps a non-commercial or NC clause onto the Creative Commons license on their OER, they're basically saying you can use this resources subject to it not being commercial. Now, the problem that we have here is that the term non-commercial is really not a very good term for this clause. And this is the one case that was actually went to court in order to be able to justify it. A better way in order to view this clause is non-profit. So in other words, you can use content that's NC licensed in a commercial effort as long as you're not financially benefiting from it. So one example from that is each of the books that are compiled in the LibreText system, you have the ability to press a button and it will push the book into a publisher, and the publisher can create a version of that book as a hardbound version, right? So you can come in, you can say, here's a book, which you can't see because it's a little bit you can't see, but anyways, I can get this book and have it shipped to me within 10 days or faster if I'm willing to pay for it. And it's a real-time version of my resource. It's great for editing, by the way, if you're going through these sort of things. But someone has to pay the printer. So that's a commercial activity. We can have the non-commercial clause on there because no one's making a profit off of that. Let me rephrase that. We're not making a profit off of it. The publisher is able to make a profit, but they're making a profit for their activity in order to be able to print it up under standard operating procedure. That's allowed. So the term non-commercial, meaning that you can't have any commercial activities off of here, is completely incorrect in order to describe that clause. But it does mean that if you are interested in taking an image, making it into a book, and then selling the book into your bookstore that you are then able to get royalties off of, you'll be in violation of that clause. There are a lot of people who get involved in the OER community that have an aversion to the financial abuse that some companies have used on that resources, like textbook publishers, and they slap this on here in order to make sure that no one is able to address this. There are people in the community that get upset with this clause, like I was talking before, in terms of some people arguing that certain licenses are better than other licenses. Some people feel that this is a violation. This is certainly not. This gives a restriction on things, so it starts to make it less open within the context. Okay, no derivative is a little bit more straightforward. If someone has a no derivative clause on it, it says that you have no rights to edit that content. You do have the rights in order to use it. You have the rights in order to change the formatting of it, but you don't have the rights to edit. So if someone actually has a misspelling in their intellectual property, in their paragraph, for example, that you want to be able to use, you can't fix it. Most people agree that when a resource has an ND clause on it, it does not constitute OER, because it doesn't handle several of the, or it doesn't allow at least one, if not two, of the R's in the 5 R's I talked about before. Most of the stuff on our site does not have the ND clause on it. A few of the things we have do have the ND clause, and you have to be careful on how to use it. And the reason that we host those things is they're still useful for students. They're still useful for faculty in order to be able to use it. You just can't use it as freely as you may want to use it. I know I'm taking a little bit of a slow time in order to address these things, but it's quite important in order to be able to get these things down, because people still argue about what you can do and can't do with these sort of clauses. Now, let me get back to the share alike, which is a little bit more complicated infrastructure here. Share alike is a bigger issue. It's basically arguing that people are allowed to share your content, but they're unable to change the license of your content. Now, this is where things kind of get weird to you, at least they got weird to me, is that Creative Commons and open licensing gives you the ability in order to take something and apply a different license to it and distribute it under a different license. It doesn't mean that you are removing the requirements of that license, of the license of the core material, but means that you can repackage it under a different license. I personally don't like this. I think it's confusing. And I think in some cases, it makes it difficult in order to understand what the licenses are for the material that we have, because you've then cleaned it up. So in that case there, if I took two materials that have two different share alike clauses and I put it on the same page, let me phrase that, two different licenses that have share alike clauses in them, but they're different licenses, there's no single license that's going to be able to satisfy both. So then I can't do that and give it a single license. I can do other tricks though. So we're going to get into more practical argument off here. So the grand scheme of these things is all the different licenses. If you put the Creative Commons license on here on a range of all rights reserved being the least open, means you have no rights, to public domain being the most open. That the number of clauses you have will give you a gradation in terms of what you're allowed to do. And each of these are licenses that are there, like this is CC BY 0, which is basically public domain. This is CC BY saying that you're allowed to use the material as long as you only attribute. This is CC BY share alike, means that you can use the material if you attribute it and don't change the license, the specific license. Then you could add non-commercial clauses onto it with share alike, as BY is always there, and you can add the non-derivative clauses onto it, which is equal, and you can slap in non-commercial or non-derivative. And this right here is one of the most painful licenses in order to address. So is this confusing to you guys? It probably should be, because it's confusing to almost everybody else that I've ever talked to, in order to be able to master what you can do and what you can't do. But this is the basic principles off of that, and we want to be able to apply that here. Now, we went through a bit of effort a couple of days ago to talk about remixing, right? And the basic concept that you learn about remixing is that you can come in and you can utilize other people's openly licensed content, relying on the O in OER, the open license, and bring it into our infrastructure. At almost no point, at least I don't think I mentioned anything about licensing. Actually, maybe I did mention it, but I wasn't intended on talking about licensing last 2 days ago off of here. There are two types of ways in which you can combine content together, or two types of designations for the content. And this is using parlance that the Creative Commons organization puts out there. One is called remixes, and the other one's called a collection. So you can have a book that would be a remix, and you can have a book that would be a collection. Now, I'm emphasizing a key point that's oftentimes brushed underneath the rug or not clear to many people in the community. But it's a very key aspect of how we view licensing within our infrastructure. So remixes essentially says that you can take and combine content together, but you're able to apply a single license to that final product. That's it. That license has to be compliant with all the licenses of everything that you used off here. So if you can do that, you're good. Wesam, I will upload this to the conductor page right after this meeting. I forgot to upload it. I'm sorry. So LibreText is set up in order to apply licenses per page. That's at the top. That's not at per book, although you can do it per book, license for every page in the book, but you can do it at per page, which means that the content on the page, if it has a single license, it's meant to apply to all the content. If you apply a single license to that page, all the content has licenses that are compliant with the license you add. Now, at this point, you may be asking, what exactly does compliance mean? And that's what we're going to be spending the vast majority of the rest of this conversation with. In contrast to a remix where you can apply a single license to, a collection does the same thing in that you reuse or combine content from one or more sources, but you don't apply a single license to that page. We're basically saying that license, we use the term undeclared. Another way in order to say that is that I cannot apply a single license that's compliant with every single license of the content on that page. I can still do this. This is allowed. I just have to make sure I'm clear in terms of designating that. And that's what makes us a bit more unique than other platforms out there, because we are very fastidious in the way that we handle licensing, conflicting of licensing, and then ultimately we're going to start to introduce logic in order to be able to tell you if you are conflicting licensing with the content that you're copying from different sources. What we do, and I'm going to be showing this in a moment, is that we provide not just licensing at the page level, but at the block level. That's at the paragraph, at the image, that we assign in the underlying HTML code, what we discussed earlier on today, a code that tells us what the license is, that we can then take and copy that text anywhere else on the LibreText, and it will automatically know the license. And that is part of our auto attribution infrastructure, which is exceedingly powerful off of here. So the auto attribution, I'll be showing you in the next slide, real time, is essentially a mechanism that we have embedded in our system to facilitate the auto attribution, that by component that's in all the Creative Commons licensing, to make sure that people are as compliant as possible with the content that they used. It ensures we essentially go through the pages, and I use the term spray paint. We essentially put code into the underlying HTML in order to make it designate like that. Now, when we started, we didn't have this infrastructure, so we still have a few pages here and there that's not spray painted, but we have been, I'd say that 80 to 90% of our corpus is set up in order to use the auto attribution infrastructure, and the rest will be set up by the end of this year. And what it does, and what we will do, is introduce a licensing compliance. So what you may have noticed at the bottom of a page, you'll have a little clause right here. Every page has this, is baked into our, that tells you the title of the page, tells you the license of the page, a hyperlink to give you a link to the license that's required by Creative Commons licensing. It tells you the author, and if this came from a specific source, it will tell you where the source is. So this is created by LibreText, so I don't need to write the source in. It's from the LibreText itself. But infrastructure will then tell me if contents on the page comes from different sources. So this is my ability in order to brand that page as me, as mine, for my own use. This right here tells me where that content comes from, if it's applicable, and it will pop up and it will say, I took content from this page from 13.4 ways of expressing concentration by anonymous. So someone didn't want to write their name down, and it was licensed by this, and it should have the attribution, the direction up here. Now, this source is a bit more complicated. It's a history thing that, if you like, I could discuss before. But this gives a way in order to keep a cataloging of all the content that's on here. So this case here is best for me to show you what this does. So I have an empty page here. This is in my sandbox. It's all nice and empty. And I have 3 pages that I want to take content from and put into here. So I'm going to edit this page. I'm going to edit each of these pages here. And I'm going to copy this into that page. There we go. I'm going to copy this into that page, and I'm going to copy this into that page. And now I'm going to save it. So I just took from 3 different sources, and I didn't even look at the licensing of these sources, but we will take a look at it in a moment. So this is the did this. Hold on one second here. Actually, this thing was not licensed in the way that I want it to be. So I'm just going to spray paint this onto here. So I should have taken a look at those pages in order to make sure that they all work out right. And so only one of the three works. So I grabbed this 3 content from this page. And what you'll see down here is that it shows me where that I grabbed content from 3 different pages. It gives me the link of where the pages are, gives me the licenses associated with the pages, gives me the authorship associated with those pages, gives me even the source of those pages if they're applicable. Kai wrote this directly on LibreText, so we don't have a source off of there. This is compliant with Creative Commons by requirements, by just copying and pasting. If you didn't have to do this, you would have to go on a piece of paper and make sure you got this code and paste it down, this to paste it down, and this to paste down into your page. And this is how everyone else does it in the community. We do it automatically by just copying and pasting that's on there. The other thing is what we've done is that we've applied licensing at each of these blocks. If you toggle this, it will actually show you the color code for each of the sources that gives you the attribution down here. Right on top of here. We need to change the color code off of here because it's not accessible, but it provides a mechanism in order to give licensing off of these things. Now, there's still a few more tricks that we want to be able to do here. The one thing to emphasize is we took content from 3 different sources. And right now, the whole page, I don't have a license on it. It's undeclared. And that can cause people some confusion. Even had to address some issues like that last week. So the issue is, okay, well, let's say that I want to come in here and I want to apply my name. So I'm going to say that I am the author of that page. I can do this. I'm actually not saying I'm the author of the content here. I'm saying that I am the owner of this remix. So I'm either authored, remixed, or curated by me. But of course, these are the authors themselves with the appropriate ethical and legal background in order to ensure that they have this in place. Now, the question that we may have is, what is the best license that we can apply to the overall page if we can? We need to get a license that applies to this one, CC BY NC Share Alike, CC BY N Share Alike, and CC BY 4.0. And in some cases I can do that, in other cases I can't. So let's talk about compliances. We're very excited about this technology. We think it's important. And as long as you remix from stuff on the LibreText, it works well. If you remix outside of LibreText and bring it in, it doesn't work well because we don't know the attributions of what you've done outside of it. So back to compliance. You are allowed to mix content and give certain licenses within certain limitations. So this is a compatibility compliance chart that's available. So these are the principal components, principal licenses on here and here. And this is essentially saying, can you take content from, can you take 2 things, it's like a truth table, and put it together and add it together in order to give a single license to do it. So it's meant as remixes, not collections. Remember, collections, I can add them together. As long as I don't give a whole license for the whole thing, it's perfectly valid. That's on there. So public domain can be mixed with public domain. It can be mixed with, actually, this is public domain. This is the Creative Commons version of public domain, which is essentially the same. You can mix public domain with CC BY, public domain with CC BY Share Alike, public domain with CC BY NC, but you can't mix public domain with CC BY ND because you're violating the non-derivative clause. Yeah, because you derived it. Yeah, you can mix public domain with CC BY NC Share Alike because you're not in violation with any of these clauses, as long as the final product is licensed by this. And you can't put it with NC ND. So you notice that ND basically gives you no permissions to mix, which is one of the reasons why we dislike this a lot. So let's go into something a little bit more complicated. CC BY share alike. So this is essentially saying that the content has a license on it, but if you share it, you can't change the license on it. So I can mix that with public domain as long as it has this license on it. I can mix it with CC BY as long as I mix it with this license. Okay, but if I were to take CC BY share alike with CC BY share alike NC, where are we? Right here. Access denied. Why is that? Well, I can't simultaneously satisfy this criteria, which requires share alike with this license, and this content with this license, which has its own share alike infrastructure. I can't do it. So the compatibility chart says that you can't combine these things under a single license. Does that mean you can't combine these things? No. You can actually combine it as long as you don't have a single license for the whole resource, and that each of the blocks that we have has their own unique licenses handled. So in other words, we treat it like a collection. But that makes things confusing to people, because essentially when someone asks, what's the license on that page, your answer would have to be, there is no license on that page. You have to look at the content itself to find out what the license is. And there's some people who are against that idea. So I think Taha has a question. I will let him do that while I get a few drinks of tea in.
Thank you. The question, one thing that you did a minute ago was to pull out your name, to give yourself, to put your name at the bottom. How to add your name to the list to be able to do that?
So right now, we have to do it manually. So you have to ask us to do so. It's not a problem. But when we fold everything into the conductor, it'll be integrated into the conductor. So you can just basically put your name down, and then you'll have the option to be able to select that when you want for that page. So
thank you.
It's a slow process, but it's currently a slow process, but it's going to be more streamlined when everything gets folded into the Commons conductor again as the portal for the LibreVerse. And I hope that that's going to be done by by the end of fall. Katie, do you have another question?
Yes, it's related. So I'm seeing at the bottom of my page that it was authored, remixed, and or curated by LibreText. When I've combined things from different pages, is that because I didn't create the original page and those were remixed in the remixer, or
so so there's several reasons for that. One is it may actually be written by people in LibreText. So there are many students have contributed content to the LibreText without wanting their name written onto it. Many, I have edited almost every page, every 500,000 pages on there, but I don't have my name associated with it, because it would make my name would be everywhere, and it's not a vanity project. So when you remix a page, it will bring over the name because it's part of metadata. If you create a new page and you start to slice and dice these things, then it's just going to be default LibreText until you assign your name under that metadata, which is what Taha was asking about. And again, I want to emphasize here that when you remix and you take content from different sources, you have the attribution associated with the page itself, which you can claim full ownership for, right? And then there's the attribution for the content that's put on the page. And that's something you can't do. So you can't come in and say, I don't like, I'm not sure which one we were. I'm going to say, I wrote this. You can't do that, because that's the by part in this license in order to be able to do that. So in other words, this is meant in order to be automatic for the content. This you can write yourself. You can put your own name down. I highly recommend it. If you brand your own version of a book, like you say, here's an OpenStax book, but I'm going to cut this, and I'm going to make it my own. You can do that, and you can brand it. This is the Katie Newton chemistry honors book. Yeah, but as long as these things are recognized and that the license here is compliant with the license there, then you're all cool. Now that right now, that latter step, making sure that the license on the page is compliant with the licenses of the content on the page, has to be manually done. But we will take that matrix here we go, and implement it into this board here in order to say whether you can do it or not. And unfortunately, as we started to do this, we found a significant number of pages in the OER community are not fully compliant, that have conflicts associated with that. So we have some issues. We're going through and cleaning them up and trying to identify them, making the collections and making sure everything is 100% tip top. And we're very motivated in order to do this, not just for a legal application, but this is the rules that we have to play by and that you have to play by. Let's just make it as easy as possible in order to make it as compliant as possible. Because if you're not compliant, you can have issues. And I'll give you an example of that before I answer a few questions here. There is one of the original founders of OER, like what I call the first generation OER platforms, is a company in San Francisco called CK12. They've done some great work out there, especially focused on K-12 and international activities. Their content was Creative Commons licensed by NC. We brought it in, but it turns out that their attribution clause required that we put a logo on on other pages of their stuff, and we were not compliant because we didn't do that. And again, this is an example of showing the importance of compliance. So what happened? They filed a cease and desist order, talked to lawyers, went through lots of issues associated, and they essentially revoked our rights to use that license. And they actually switched over to a different license that's not a Creative Commons license, called an Open Materials license or something along those lines, and has some very specific clauses that we needed to implement into the infrastructure. So the upshot of that, and that was actually quite a painful effort on our side, but it was all within their rights in order to be able to do. The key point is it's important to make sure that what you're doing is legally sound. And that means in the OER world, all these sort of attribution components are addressed off of there. Am I beating this hard? Very much. It's a very important component off of there. But we've built an infrastructure that's the most powerful infrastructure for handling this in the OER, the current OER landscape out there, and it's going to get even more powerful in the near future. Okay, Wessam, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Please correct me.
Wissam or Wissam. So
Wissam? Okay.
Thank you so much. This is this presentation is very important because myself, I was confused with a couple of things. One thing for non-NED. So NED means I cannot edit anything in the content, right?
No, not entirely.
The reason I'm asking this question, I'm asking about the NED specifically, non-derivatives, because some of the CC BY product that's actually available has this ND license.
Mm-hmm.
So I have two questions. First thing you mentioned, I cannot edit at all, even if there is a spelling mistakes. And I actually have one of the ND OER that has a lot of spelling mistakes I found, and I changed those spelling mistakes. Right now, I have to go back and keep them.
Yeah, you have to revert that. So their intellectual property rights includes the spelling mistakes.
Okay, so this is my first question.
So you can't technically. So, but let me address the first question because it's more complicated. It's a more complicated response. ND, just like when I said non-commercial, doesn't mean non-commercial. Non-derivative doesn't mean fully non-derivative. It doesn't mean you can't touch it. So you have certain permissions. So you could take ND content and change the formatting. So that's how we can take ND content from one source and put it into the LibreText. As long as we don't modify the content itself, just the structure. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as I come in and I say, valence bond theory here should be molecular orbital theory. Okay, and if I write that in there, I am then violating, if this is ND claused, which is not, but if it were, then I'd be violating it. I can't do that. But I do have the ability, and this is where some people get a little, feel this is a little in the gray area. I can come in and I can take this section and, let me see if take this section right here and then say, this is my text. So when I make a new section up like that, it will take the license of the page. But what I've done is I could take the ND clause and I can make this ND licensed and this ND license, but this right here could be different licensed.
Mhm.
So you can see right now, it doesn't have, it should have the license of the page that's written down there, but it's not, I haven't added anything onto it other than my name and such. So if I were to change the license on that page, which you can do by here, by selecting, let's say CC by ND. And those things are already, you have access to this entire page settings here. It still doesn't add because I needed to add the attribution onto it, but okay. So you can kind of slice and dice these things as long as you mix the licensing on here. But some people may consider that to be pushing it beyond what you're allowed to do. But legally, you can do that. I should point out I'm not an attorney, so don't take my legal advice. But you should be able to do this from my perspective. So you're stuck. If that's the thing, you're stuck with an ND. How it is. There are lots of things that are out there that are ND, which is just a travesty because they age, they die out. You're stuck with them. There's a very good speech book that we've been fighting for a while in order to be able to address, and that's the case. So does that answer? Are you
yeah,
guys
this is actually answer my first question, but there is a follow-up question related to, for example, if I am taking part of the chapter that's ND, I can take part of what is written in the OER, or I have to share the whole chapter to be able to really ND non-derivative?
You could take parts.
I can take part.
Because the way we view it is that we can put the license right here. So as long as the overall license, actually it doesn't even matter if you have an overall license, because this is a collection, you can do that. So but you just can't edit the content here because I've designated that as, you know, this is the person, this is the license, and this is how it is, and you got to deal with it.
So I can take part of the ND as long as I'm not editing or changing anything in this content.
Precisely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Now, like I said, there are other people in the community that would feel that pushes the boundaries of ND, but legally you can do that. And we do that. Many people do that all the time. For example, there are many people who insert images because everything I'm talking about here applies to everything on the page. So the text, the images, if you have audio on the page or other, even videos on the page. However, videos, if it's like YouTube videos, they're open access, which means that you're allowed to do it. They give you that permission, even though it's not OER. Sometimes it's not OER. Most of the time it's not OER. But sometimes people put images in the page and you put the attribution of the images.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be an ND image.
Yes.
That's fine because it doesn't, you're designated as different from other sources. But there's a lot of, I think, slop in the community, and we're trying to make things a little bit more crystallized in order to be as compliant as possible without just giving a single license and say, here you go. But the issue, but when you're trying to be as detailed as we are, it adds a lot of complexity, but it gives you a lot of power when you know what you're allowed to do. So I apologize for the complexities. This is the realities of the open world. And there's still a lot of stuff I'm brushing underneath the rug. Mohammed?
Yes, two questions. First, I maybe did not listen if you said how we bring those additional licenses, say for this paragraph and this paragraph separately at the end. I see that you did that, but I don't know how. And the second question
they come
is,
in the HTML. So since you are advanced, if you want to look at the HTML, it has this class right here. And that tells me that it's a chemistry page, and this is the chemistry page, and it goes to that page and grabs the attribution and brings it in. So if I were to come in and I were to delete that, hopefully this is an existing page, it will then change the attribution for that block to something else, unless it doesn't exist. Okay, so now it grabs something from amine heterocycle have important issues because I changed that block entry right here. So
okay, so
this is one of the things that we do. So remember I said, when you publish a paper, publish a book, and we put it into the bookshelves, we go through some criteria and evaluate it. This is one of the criteria we do. We make sure that it's all spray painted properly. So it's all out there so then everyone can benefit from it.
Okay. The second question is the YouTube. If I cut some image from YouTube, is it open access or is it not open access?
It's not technically open access. If you take a snapshot from YouTube. So the YouTube has set up, YouTube videos are typically either Creative Commons license, but you have to find it. When you upload a video, you have to find the license in order to designate it, or what they may call like a YouTube license. The YouTube license is just saying it is open access. It's meant for anybody can look at it, can read it. And but you can't necessarily edit it or redistribute it. Now, why do they do that? Well, because when you look at it, you then get to see an ad. So they're more than happy in order to let you do that stuff. Yeah. This is also one of the reasons why I want to build a video streaming repository within the LibreVerse, so we then can host videos and not have to worry about the ads issues, which is a very detrimental component for students when you're studying. Of course, ad blocks are one way in order to get around it. So the upshot, like what I said, started with, you can't take a picture of it because you don't have the rights to do so.
Okay.
Then OER. Now, you can argue fair use. That's outside of the licensing argument, but let's not talk about. Some people argue you can do that more freely than others. It's unprotected use that's intended for you to be able to do. So,
Okay.
Deborah.
Okay, so in addition to that comment, then I use like 1,000 videos in my textbooks. And they're all from YouTube because that's about the only way to get them in unless you embed them, and which is very time consuming. So how does that work, or should I just be quiet and go away?
Oh, no. Like I said, the videos, you can embed any videos into our pages. The YouTube licensing allows that. They encourage that. Why? Because your students will get ads. So of course they want to do this.
Okay.
So you're basically doing their distribution work. You're part of their marketing plan when you actually put that in place.
Okay. Well, a lot of stuff we use is from museums and they don't have that, but still.
Okay. Well, that starts getting to other issues if they host them outside of YouTube. But if they're hosting within YouTube, it implicitly is designed, the licenses that you put on there, either the Creative Commons licensing or the YouTube licensing, is intended for at least open access.
Okay.
And open access does not mean OER necessarily, unless it's Creative Commons license. It just means you have part of the 5 Rs, but you have enough in order to handle what you want, which is to distribute the video to your students.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, along the same lines, I sat through a presentation a few years ago with some company that came up and said, pay for us, we will scrape your website, scrape your book, and put it all into a package, and I'll have the videos there and the audio and the text and the images and all be ready to go. And I basically argued that that was completely illegal, that you can't scrape the videos, because you don't have redistribution rights unless the videos are Creative Commons licensed. Just because they're on YouTube does not mean they're OER. So, Susan, you have another question? And I know that there are things in the chat here, but there's still hands up here.
I do. So a little earlier, you actually showed where you went into the page settings and wrote your name in, and you were able to be the curator of that page. I do not have that option. When I go into the page I've been playing with, it has
so right now it's not
people that.
Yeah. So I need to manually put this in. We will make it so that when you create an account on the conductor, you'll have the option in order to do that automatically. But right now we haven't set that up because we're slowly transitioning into where I want to go. So you do have one ability in order to address that. In any time that you want, if you push author at Joe Blow, that right there will act as the license way. So that can handle any arbitrary name. So you don't necessarily need to have the author list down here in order to put your name on here. It's just that this is this is how we do it right now, is you can do this for some of them, and for any arbitrary one, you could put them down here. And I'll give you more details about that later on. It's a relatively new feature, but it's just basically a meta tag that we have put under there in order to be able to identify it. So you can come in and say author at
My
Susan.
name, right? Not Joe Blow. Thank you. Okay. I was like, who's Joe Blow and why does he get my own credit?
Yeah,
That's right.
So now I've added it, this thing. And now it adds both your names here. So you can just continue on doing that. And that gives you a lot more flexibility in order to handle this in a variety of different ways. But it's a fair question. And like I said, things will be, when things get fully integrated into the conductor, these things will be really easy in order to be able to implement. So, Taha?
You know, in terms of attribution, for the images that you can add to designate for labeling sections, chapters, those images, how to give,
Oh, the
it does
thumbnail,
not really ask you.
the thumbnails.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the thumbnails. Yeah.
okay, and the question was, what was that again? How do you upload it?
How to give attributions to those?
Oh, yeah. So what I do is this down here. I have this code that says thumbnail, and that's where I write down the attribution for the thumbnail. Because these things are used decoratively, and I don't want this text to be right there. So I just paste it down below and say the thumbnail, and this is the license for that, and keep it like that.
So you add it as text at the bottom.
I add it as text. So if you actually
you.
edit this thing, you'll see this has the code for the table of contents, and then I add the text here.
Thank you.
Tom, you have a question?
Yeah. So at our house, we've been talking a lot about Chat GPT. Maybe you don't want to get into this now, but what if you write something with Chat GPT, which just gathers information and gives no one any attribution whatsoever? What happens?
Okay.
Sorry.
This is subject to litigation right now, because the issue is the data used for the training model, which is typically intellectual property protected. How does that reflect in the output, or even the ability to train the model and the output of the training model, both for graphics and for text? And right now, it's very complicated because if you get the text out, you don't know where it came from.
Right.
You just don't know. You don't know the attribution that's associated with it.
Yeah.
So what do? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. So this borders on people's ethical opinions on how to go about doing that. We've been using ChatGPT in order to make summaries and to identify keywords. And you can't copyright keywords, can't copyright individual words. So that's fine from the output of that. But the answer is going to be probably, unless the government decides they're going to close down AI or significantly retool them. And to be honest, I don't think they're going to do that. It's too significant of a change. They're probably going to let them do what they're going to do, despite some of the issues off of it. Now, personally, I think they shouldn't do that, but that's a personal opinion. So the upshot is I don't have a good answer for that, but it's a very good question. And it's one that we are going to be battling for several years in terms of intellectual property ownership and rights off of that. I've seen people write down attribution connected to ChatGPT. If you feel comfortable doing that, you can do that. But there are also some people that argue that ChatGPT is not an author and really has no attribution requirements and doesn't even have the mental capacity in order to be creative, in order to be protected by intellectual property rights, which is also true. So depends on how you view it.
Okay.
Sorry to drop the ball there, but it's not an easy answer.
Yeah.
Jessica.
Hi, I have a quick question. There's a lot of different information on websites. I teach political science, so people's really great political blogs that do a good job of explaining things, or even at times some government pamphlets or documents that might be interesting. If I'm able to write the author, but these sites generally have no license attached. If I
Well,
write
they may have no indicated license. Or it
Right,
might be
right.
hard to do. That's actually what you're going to be doing in your breakout room, is to go through and identify some licensing of content. But if your question is basically how can you use it?
Yes.
Okay. So you have to contact the owner of the blog, because you're going to have to assume that they have the intellectual property rights to it, and therefore they're allowed to give the permission out. And once they give permission out, then you have to ask what type of license that they want to give. I have had a gaggle, half a dozen or a few dozen of pages that are fully all rights reserved on LibreText, with the permission that they can be used within the LibreText infrastructure.
Okay, that was my question. Yeah.
So even if someone says, no, I don't want to put an open license on it, but I will let you use it for your purposes, you can have all rights reserved, used with permission.
Okay.
And that's
great.
allowed, but some people will argue that's not open license, that's not open content. You need to make sure it's signified. I mean, you'll see when you have a list of options down there, you'll also for licensing on the you'll see all rights reserved. So we can recognize that content that's there. But I typically tend to beg people in order to make them open license and say the importance that are off of there. And we used to be very aggressive in order to do that with the community, going out and trying to find it, because we found lots of really good things on individual websites that address like small little things here and there. Not a real big book, but here are 5 pages or 10 pages on advanced kinetics dealing with blah, blah, blah. And
Right.
we ask the authors, and 9 times out of 10, the authors will give it to us. And we did a lot of the growth of the initial growth of the Chem Wiki was based off of that. We haven't done it quite so much these days because there's so much other OER out there, but we still do harvest from existing materials. But you have to contact the author in order to be able to get full permission of that.
Okay.
And if you want to be legal, like super legal, you need to get a written document in order to be able to do that. I personally don't do that, but I really should. And then you then you host that in a spot that everyone can go to, which is like the conductor page for your site. So you can always go back to the conductor stage, and here are the permissions that are given for your resources, and everyone knows it's 100% cool. The reality is essentially, if the intellectual property owner doesn't ever complain with appropriate permission, no one else can complain about you using their stuff.
Okay, so follow up. I don't have to ask them to somehow change their own website and
No,
make it.
no.
As long as I have the email saying you're good, I'm good.
Yeah. And if you have questions about how to do that, contact us. Like I said, we've done this hundreds of times.
Okay.
You mentioned governmental websites. That's a slightly different story. So if you are talking about the federal government, most of the federal government documents have to be public domain. Although
Sure.
I've seen more of them wanting to go to Creative Commons licensing. I'm not entirely sure how they do that, because I thought it was codified in law, but whatever. However, that doesn't apply to state governments, municipalities, things like that. They have the full rights to have full intellectual property of what they're doing and not give you it. But most of the time, they're also quite open for educational purposes. If you reach out to them, you can get permissions off of that.
Okay, great. That's what I was worried about. State of California stuff. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Michelle sent an email from the author creator. I don't know if that's a question or a statement. Michelle, technically the lawyers would want to have a physical copy for it, but they want to have everything fully documented. I use just an email that says, this is my content and I give you permission to use open license. Typically that's part of the email chain. So they don't even have to write a special email just to describe that. So as long as everyone's cool, it works. I will mention that I have had one of my my colleagues on my campus ask me to harvest a book for chemical engineer. We went through the effort of harvesting the money and put them all together, and then afterwards they went to a commercial publisher and decided they wanted to publish it commercially, and they asked us to take it down. Technically, the Creative Commons licensing is irrevocable. as long as you're fully compliant, which means that you can't change the content on the stuff. However, I chose not to argue that, in part because I didn't have a document that said clearly, you said that this has to be Creative Commons license. We had email conversation behind it, and I chose not to make a stink off of it. But some people do change their minds when they learn more about what open licenses mean, because it's not for everybody. Okay.
I just pop in and say we're running into our editing,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. This is the follow-up for this this discussion, right?
What do you mean?
This is the breakout. Okay. How about we pause this conversation? I will. I had a few slides off of here, including giving you some practice examples or sort of homework. I'll move this homework into you guys in order to do this later on at your leisure, and then we can talk about it in more detail on Friday.